Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lindsay Gazowski, partner at Falcon and CEO of The Crucible, which is an executive assessment predicated on the private equity market. And we're here today to talk about driving growth in private equity through human capital analytics. PE funds have long applied rigorous analytics to financial performance, but human capital, which is often one of the most critical drivers of value, tends to be a bit of an analytical blind spot. And despite culture being cited as a key factor in acquisition success, leadership and workplace performance are often treated subjectively, making it difficult to implement measurable improvements. So with talent optimization playing an increasingly vital role in driving investor returns, funds and portcos need a data-driven approach to leadership and culture. So I've brought on my co-founders at the Performance Learning Leadership Lab to chat on these topics. So I'd like to introduce Bob Dunn and Will Lindstrom. I'll kick it over to them to give their own bios, and then we'll launch into this roundtable discussion. So Bob, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Lindsay, and thank you all for joining us. We're excited with the opportunity to talk a little bit on this subject. Just in terms of background, I'm managing director of GF Data, which is a business owned by the Association for Corporate Growth. GF Data's objective is to bring clarity to the lower middle market. We do that by surveying more than 300 private equity firms on completed deals on a quarterly basis, collect about 30 data points from each, and then aggregate and anonymize the data to provide valuation information across size of deal as well as industry, and then a bunch of other information, including the debt coverage on deals, the pricing of debt, key deal terms, and financial performance of the companies as well. So really our goal and our objective is to benchmark the middle market and provide some accuracy there where there's not a lot of information available. And we're very happy to be here, Lindsay.
Great. Will, give us a perspective on who you are.
Sure thing. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of the Culture Think Tank. And at the Culture Think Tank, we're really about trying to resolve the very issue that Lindsay brought up, which is how do you better understand the needs of the workforce and what leadership actions can be taken to drive ultimately financial performance. And so what we do is we specialize in developing the analytics that provide the leadership intelligence that can be transformed into workplace performance and ultimately give the leading indicators that provide insight into the lagging indicators that are ultimately going to drive financial return. So that's what we've been focused on for the last 3 years, and it's been a really fun opportunity to collaborate with the Crucible and GF Data to bring in additional analytics. So not only can we provide insights into what leaders can do, we can also better understand and identify how the leadership team is able to do it, where they can focus, and then ultimately benchmark that against GF Data's exit and financial return metrics. So you can actually start to see how direct action and direct insights in the workforce translate into financial returns and ultimately exit and investor returns.
Fantastic. Well, let's launch into our first topic here, which is really about human capital as a blind spot in private equity. I think one of the challenges that many funds are seeing and portfolio companies themselves is that you need to really rely on more than financial engineering to generate returns these days. And a lot of that has to do with making sure you've got the right teams, both at the executive and at the workforce levels, focused on the right things to achieve the right results, which seems incredibly obvious to everyone, but we're not really managing the metrics behind those in most of these companies. Speaking from the recruitment perspective, we see so many of these companies where in the investment memos, they'll grade the leadership team and everyone's a B. Clearly not everyone's a B. You've called a recruiter 6 months later. But that's how they were assessed going into it because it was a subjective finding and people were just putting down a letter so that they could feel good about the investment and move forward. That might be, compared to hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on trying to understand contracts and financials and, legal review and other items that tend to have gotten a lot more attention over time with regard to these metrics. So, given that culture and leadership and human capital in general is so critical in this space, why is there such a disconnect between how important people say it is and think it is and how they're actually going about measuring it and the performance that people see going into these investments? Will, do you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen on the blind spots there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest issue, and my background was in consulting focused on turnaround. So we were always looking at the data and the people and trying to figure out the metrics. And ultimately we would spend, weeks, if not months, interviewing and trying to understand the insights of the people. And I think the biggest issue is, and I always like to look at or think about it as a deck of cards. Here's a deck of cards. This is everything that a leader needs to know to be able to execute. The issue is that this is what everybody trains on, this is what everybody scores on, but it's knowing what to do when. And that's the issue that really starts to arise when it comes to driving culture and driving performance, is understanding what the workforce really needs. How do you stay in tune to that so that the leader knows which card in the deck to pull out to say, okay, this is what we need to do. Because you can't throw the whole deck at them. That's an MBA program or an undergrad program. So that's really, I think, where the blind spot comes about. It's not about the how. Lots of talent out there. It's having that insight to know what to do when. Once you have that and you can narrow it down to focus on what you need to do, most leaders are able to, or leadership teams are able to come together and go, this is what we need to do. Okay, now let's talk about why this is occurring and how to deal with it. When you get down to that type of focus, you can execute. And that's ultimately what we've been trying to get to, is how with, through analytics, how do you start to bring that insight forward, have that connection to the workplace forward, and then you can really start to see the effectiveness of leaders. And more importantly, leaders can start to better assign, delegate, and align to drive that performance.
Well, and to that point, when you think about great leaders, they don't come in, one flavor. So there might be certain initiatives and certain cultural elements that are best represented by a certain type of leader. And if you understood that this specific leader is really great with systems and processes, if you have an implementation that needs to happen, maybe have that person champion it. You're probably going to get better buy-in from your group and better integration of new companies. If you need someone who can really help maintain a spirited workplace, maybe there's someone who pings highly on collegiality that could truly embrace that existing culture and help drive things forward to ensure the investment thesis is met. Bob, talk a little bit about what you've seen in the cultural challenges created in add-ons, because that's obviously a critical piece of where some of these cultural values clash, and how certain companies that are rolling along and doing just fine find themselves in dire straits.
Yeah, I mean, I think well, first off, I completely agree with your point. Financial engineering isn't going to cut it anymore. I think, performance improvement is the name of the game. And, last year we tracked a record number of add-on investments versus platforms. Close to half the deals we tracked were add-ons. That tells you there's a lot of integration going on. Private equity investing is a time game. The quicker you can get out of that, successfully get out of that investment, the better your IRR is going to be. And you see that in the first 90 days, first 30 days, a lot of cases with an acquisition. What do we need to do? What do we have to do with systems? What do we have to do with operations? But what do we have to do with human capital? Like you said, kind of gets pushed to the side a little bit on it. Interestingly, also, we had, and they're related, but the increase in add-on investing went with challenges in the debt markets, easier to to grow companies by acquiring other businesses when you have an existing debt facility or revolver you can draw on, et cetera, on it. But in the midst of those credit challenges, we actually saw, and it was relatively unprecedented, but rollover equity going to add-ons that were acquired by a platform. So I mean that adds in some more complications structurally on there. And again, I think a lot of this is just what you said, Lindsay. How do you fit the right person into the right role at the right time? And how do you know that ahead of time so that you're not trying to do it on the fly? And I think optimizing the team is one of those key performance metrics that you can really gain a lot of ground on, as well as helping with the integration of the investments that you acquire through the platform.
And how do you think that's going to continue to change as we get to what might be a record year in exits? What kind of lessons do you think people have started to learn from?
Yeah, so we have three factors that we believe leads to improved valuations on the exit side. One is sale from a private equity firm or a corporation, just generally a higher level of sophistication than with an independent seller. One is above average financial performance, which is kind of an obvious one. A stronger business is going to go for a higher multiple. But the third is, does management continue on? And that has been proven to add between a turn to 2 turns of EBITDA onto the valuation of a company, because it's something that the buyer doesn't have to worry about going in. Or at the very least, they can figure out maybe that person's no longer in the role of CEO, but they could step into another role, heading a division, et cetera, on it. But I think it's really managing those people and effectively managing that to ultimately lead not only to the success of the investment, but to a higher valuation coming out of it. And I think the more you can do to focus on that management team, as well as the middle managers below it on it, and be able to show that this is something that's been thought about prior to the actual sale on it, it's going to greatly improve the prospects for the business on the exit side.
And just quickly before, and Will, feel free to chime in at any point here, but with the rise of the operating partner as a part of this ecosystem, where does that fit into some of these plays?
I mean, I think that's a great example, and I think one of the reasons that we're pursuing this effort right now, right? The operating partner went from a relatively fringe, larger firms would have 1 or 2 15 years ago, to now it's pretty standard on it, but you need to be of a certain scale to get an operating partner. And an operating partner is basically someone with experience on it, who's done this a few times and can step into that. But I still think from that role, it's going more with experience and gut than actual analytics on it. And I think what we're talking about with PL3 here is kind of allowing folks that do not have the opportunity to have an operating partner in there, or if they do have an operating partner, how do you actually categorize and track the successful investments, and then how do you improve on it, right? It's not a matter of a failed investment, but everything can always be better. Being able to look at the management there, being able to look at the KPIs on it, and really being able to quantify it, I think adds so much to that, operating partner gut level instinct and experience on it. Not to say that one's more important than the other, but generally the analytical side has been lacking, I think, on it. It's been more, okay, this is an experienced person, they'll handle it well, but what actually defines that? What are the characteristics? And then also, how can that person improve? How can they learn from what they've done? So I think on both sides of it, but it's definitely, I think the rise of the operating partner speaks to the importance of, again, not financial engineering, but actually improving the business on all facets of it, but particularly the human capital side.
Well, and I think to that end, part of what operating partners historically have done is to be able to say, look, I've done this before many times, hopefully, and I can show you what mistakes we've made and where you can try to avoid them. But part of applying greater analytics to these businesses across the board is that you're able to identify some of those potential pitfalls early and really put yourself in a position where you're not creating the mistake that, 10 years ago, you'd have no visibility to until the business didn't do quite as well and extended its hold period and didn't yield the results it wanted. So you can kind of de-risk some of what you're doing by having leading indicators, and also by measuring more stuff, because what's measured can be managed. Whereas
exactly, and it can be done on the fly.
things.
right? Yeah, it doesn't have to
Exactly.
be after the investment is done and you kind of take score on it. It's okay, look at this area, look at that area as you're going through on it. And I think that sort of ability to course correct or enhance is really, really exciting. I very much see it as being part of the future of private equity and portfolio companies.
And I think also the analytics can help the operating partner be more effective more quickly.
Yes.
That
Correct.
was one of the biggest challenges we had whenever we go from client to client, and even now, is understanding where the problems are, understanding where the leadership, if you think about it, bottlenecks, where the leadership or the workforce bottlenecks, and through analytics, if part and parcel to an operating partner, now they can just get to impact much more quickly with a greater degree of confidence. And that just makes, faster returns for everybody, especially with regards to the impact the operating partner can make and how quickly and nimbly the leadership team can adjust.
And will I add in their prioritization of what you're looking at also, right? So you can kind of
Yes.
see which fires are burning the hottest, the closest, and manage those on it, which again, without an analytical platform and basis on it, I think it's challenging to do that. We're all inclined to look at the things that, we think are the most
Squeakiest
important,
wheel.
but we're often wrong about that. So I think the methodology, being able to collect the data, being able to put it into a schematic, and then being able to measure it gives you a way not only to move quickly, but then also to look at the elements that are going to have the biggest impact on the ultimate return on the investment.
Yeah, and we're getting a fair number of questions from the attendees that, Will, I think you are particularly well positioned to answer. To talk a little bit about, we're saying we're measuring metrics in the workforce and the types of performance behaviors we're looking for, but can you talk a little bit more deeply about what exactly is measured, how it's measured, and why it matters?
Yeah, so what's interesting is the funny thing about people is people are people. And so if you think about what leaders are taught and you start at what are the biggest fundamental topics that leaders are taught, oftentimes are all correlated back to performance management theory. They're all correlated back to fundamentals that people have been attempting to overcome for years. Some of the most common that we caught in field tests were remove red tape. I mean, this is something that instinctively we all know is out there, but knowing that it exists and where it exists and the impact it's having, now you can start to have some really insightful conversations that greases the wheels or the gears and just helps accelerate that performance. So ultimately, what we're measuring are what are those fundamental leadership needs that the workforce is asking for. So you just ask the workforce, what is it that you need your leader to start doing, continue doing, and stop doing that's going to help you perform in context to the goal of the organization and in context to the impact on the financials. When you can bring that triangulation together, now you're starting to identify, back to Bob's point, it's not the squeaky wheel, what is really going to have the biggest impact that as leaders we can address right now that's going to give us those results. And so if you just go through, and what we've spent a lot of time doing is going into the research, validating the research against real case studies and real companies, and you'll find that there are basically 30 critical leadership levers that drive performance, and identifying which one of those are floating to the top, remove red tape, tell us the direction of the organization, remove inefficiencies, stop with the double standards, stop making everything a top priority. Let's get down to focus. Just those basic fundamentals in context to what you're trying to do allows you to make those continual improvements that allow you to just focus your efforts, know where you need to put your energy, know what obstacles you need to get out of the way of your people, and then let your people just perform. And it's not rocket science. It's just back to the whole point on blind spots. It's just when you're in the middle of it, it's hard to understand what's really happening at the workforce level. Where can I put my energy? And then measure the impact that it has. Because back to Bob's point, you're always going to be learning. The operating partner can come in and begin to support. And then, to the point Lindsay was bringing up about understanding the mix of the leaders. Now you can understand where the strengths and weaknesses are of the leaders. So you can apply the right effort by putting the right person in the right spot to drive that success.
And Will, I think I'd add, because we're talking very much top down on this and, improving management on it. But if you can imagine a situation where 90% of your workers believe there's too much red tape, or I can't do my job, or that sort of thing. And rather than, I think, doing the standard of, yeah, I know, suck it up for a while type of thing, but actually seeing, hey, this is the priority, we'll deal with this now. Your employees seeing that it was actually dealt with. It was a problem. It was dealt with. That engenders a tremendous amount of goodwill among the workforce. And I think, again, it's not something you get from going back and looking at past deals and seeing what worked and what didn't. This is immediate. This is, what are the needs of this particular portco at this particular time in order to get us to that exit that we're looking to get to on it. And it's all real time, but analytics that are actionable on it. So I think it's a two-way street on it, and
It is, and that's
both
the
sides
goal. Is
benefit.
that you ask the workforce down, the workforce tells it up, and then you feedback. Here's what we learned. Here's what we're going to do. And the best part is with analytics now and these regression analysis that can do things in real time versus hours and hours of computing time. You only need a few questions to get there. You don't need to go through a 41 100 question engagement survey. You can do it with just 2 or 3 critical questions, and it's going to give you what you need to do when. But back to your point, Bob, it's really important to give that feedback back. This is what we heard. This is how we're going to address it. And then you just ask a very simple question. How do we do? And they'll tell you almost, but it's still stuck here. And you're like, great. And now you're just picking up that momentum. You're just picking up that speed. And that's ultimately, trajectory is what's going to get you the return.
Well, and it's nice because you can take a lot of these data points on a monthly basis. You're asking 3, 4, 5 questions that are quick and easy. It's not a ton of investment. It's not bringing in a consultant to sit down and look at your workforce and interview people specifically and all that. And there are places for that, don't get me wrong, but there's also a lot you can do with just simply asking. One of the really interesting things as we were talking about some of the connection points here is that there's a concept of organizational anxiety that Will's group can measure, that it really has a keen insight into, even if things are going okay, even if the business is doing the things and addressing the issues and needs, how are people feeling about it? And in these times of acquisition and integration, that's stressful for a business and the people working there. And it's not just, oh, we have 100 days to get a number of things done, and here's what we want to achieve, and here's the measures that we have to ensure we've hit in order to be successful. But it's also, how about all the people that are doing the work in the cubicles? Are they able to achieve what they should be, or are they stressed about it in a way that's negatively impacting performance? And that's even a very cynical way of looking at it, not to mention supporting your team, because your team are comprised of people and you may care about those people. Private equity gets a bad rap for being, corporate raiders and going in and destroying these companies. And for the most part, private equity is actually building the American workforce. And so this gives an opportunity when you're applying more metrics and more insight to help groups of people feel bought into the success and the future of their business and that continued growth, which it promotes, everyone's goals at the end of the day.
And what's interesting about the anxiety, and touching a little bit back on the management theory, if you look at anxiety from what drives performance, it's basically just on an index of challenge. How challenged does the individual feel, and how confident do they feel in achieving that challenge? And when they're both, that's your Michael Jordan with 3 seconds left on the clock. You just love that environment. But when that confidence starts to drip, the challenge starts to go up, and now you end up in this point of anxiety where you're going to just freeze. But if you think about the measures that you're looking at, it's how well can they address the challenge and how confident are they doing it? Those are performance metrics. And when you're helping that team remain confident in their ability to perform, and they have a moderate degree of challenge, it's okay to have too much or a little bit. You want some amount of stress. You don't want it stress free, But when it gets too much, now their confidence starts to drip. But you're basically just playing on the levers that's going to drive ultimate performance. I mean, there's a certain amount of managed anxiety that you want. You want people to feel pressure to perform, but knowing when it's getting out of balance and why, you can then step in as a leader and go, okay, we got this. Here's what we're going to do. And now people are right back to confident, challenging, and they're just performing. So it's back, always coming back to the fundamentals of performance management.
And Will, I think the just what you're saying there on the challenge, if you have direction and you feel like you know where the business is heading and there's alignment or understanding of the strategic vision of it, that can make challenges a lot easier to overcome. But when you don't have that, it can be insurmountable, right? So I think again, and I think you're right. You want a certain amount of stress within the portco. You need that to be effective and to ultimately hit your target on it. But on the flip side, too much of that is going to cause confusion in the workforce, disillusionment, and like you said, people freezing up. They can do the job, but they can't do the job if they're worried about everything else that's going on there. So I think the point's well made.
Yeah, and I think that there's a critical aspect to understanding not just who your leadership team is now, but what skills and traits you need when you get to exit. And how does your how do your traits translate to that? But also, how do they translate for your workforce? How does the company incorporate that culture and understand how they can also get the business to exit in a way that is productive and fulsome for really everyone? We're talking a lot about analytics and metrics and how you can do those in more real time, but one of the hot topics in analytics writ large right now is AI. So, Will, you want to comment a little bit on AI? I think you're probably the most experienced in going into that side of the fence of the three of us, but kick off our discussion.
Yeah, I think with AI, there's a big word AI out there. I mean, I think my background was in mathematical modeling, which is also AI. You're using algorithms to kind of determine and predict what are the most important actions to take and why. And then you have machine learning as you get the responses back, you get smarter and smarter. So I think that's been a large part of the analytics side of it. But where the AI is really coming into place is, again, accelerating the impact I think operating partners can have, because now you can start to ask the questions. When you have the financials, the benchmarks, the traits layered into it, and you have what the needs are of the organization, now you can start asking those really detailed questions of, what do I need to focus on now? What's the likelihood that it's that I need to do this? Who's best suited for it? And now with generative AI, that report can come out, that insight can come out that fast. And so now you're able to make those leadership meetings, make those discussions, interactions with the operating partners even more impactful, because now you're working off the integration or the analysis that's done very, very quickly versus, I remember spending weeks writing some of these types of reports. And by the time you get through them, you're already into almost another quarter. There's something else that's come up, but now you're getting it in almost real time. So you're able to be very responsive, and you're able to harness the insights more quickly and more effectively. I really see that's where, in this space, the generative AI comes out, is just being able to ask, well, how are my two different leaders doing right now, and who needs which help and why, and to have it come back and say, okay, this leader has this type of a challenge and has this type of a profile and needs this type of a support, and this one needs X, Y, and Z. And so now you can just have these very insightful, very impactful discussions very quickly. I really see that's where the acceleration is coming in. And the more insight, the more financial analysis, the more benchmarking you bring in, the more precise the machine learning is going to get in saying, okay, this is the most important one to focus on. But I think the AI, the generative AI, is really just going to help take all these insights and put it into an action plan that you can very quickly and easily act upon.
And I think that one of the fears with AI is that it generates things that don't exist. And if you're using it correctly, that's not true. It's helping to find the patterns and essentialize things that otherwise would take, as Will said, weeks, if not months, to produce on our own. People are biased and people are slow. Computers tend to be less so on both if they're well programmed. And it enables, I think, more discussion, more action. I heard, and I'm apologies to him because I've completely forgotten his name, but there was a brilliant gentleman who was talking about using AI in marketing, who suggested that AI is really like a fantastic intern. You can trust what it says and then verify it. They've done all the work for you. They've made your life easier. And then you have to figure out what to do with that information. And utilizing that in human capital understanding, it provides all the trends. It shows what is happening here and can provide some knowledge about what has worked in the past for similar trend sets so that you can take that information and push it forward. But it only works if it's tied to fundamental, legitimate data that also has its own analytics that are able to be highlighted and utilized and leveraged.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Lindsay. And I wouldn't call myself an AI skeptic, but you look at some of the results at the top of the Google page that are AI generated, and sometimes things don't look quite right. But you flip it around, and I would equate this to the next step with what AI has done with the deal room. I think most of the people on this webinar have been in deal rooms before. I think most of them know how awful it can be and how arduous when you're going through and you have thousands of pages of documentation, you're trying to find everything. AI has revolutionized that now. So it can actually go across and pull in all the information you need in one place, and really just about saving time or having, 25 interns that you don't have to pay, or, that can do all this grunt work for you. And I think what we're talking about here is a similar thing on the human capital side, where again, you don't have to take the time to do the analysis and break it down. The machine will do that for you. Fine, verify it, but the metrics are all there. You can verify against that, but you're saving time. And I think that's the biggest challenge is time within private equity, right? It's going to impact your return. It's going to impact the confidence in the investment. It's going to impact your employees. You need to be very, very cognizant of how you use that time. And I think the AI in this case, with performance management and metrics, is huge. And again, the real-time course correct is huge.
And to that point of the real-time course correct and being able to utilize that, I think one of the items that people forget in these environments is that they're always dynamic. Everything is changing all the time. So when you're looking at some static analytics, it's actually very difficult to understand, okay, we ran these numbers. They were from last quarter. We're looking historically, here are the trends and everything we're seeing. And now the world's slightly different. Or now we're integrating, our fifth add-on. Well, what does that mean for the future of what we're doing? And so having some of these, again, AI-based, more real-time analytics and things that can be working in the background to help you make those decisions faster should yield hopefully better results, or at least more up-to-date information.
And I think also it gives you the ability to measure from a statistical perspective how statistically valid are the answers. That's some of the other thing. It's not only taking the guesswork out, it's also giving you validity, because as these solutions start to learn, you can say, okay, well, in 4 months, here's the impact that it's making with this degree of statistical validity or this degree of significance. And so that starts to add, I think Bob brought up the point of confidence. It starts to give you a stronger amount of confidence that what you're hearing from the workforce is driving impact, and you're not having to take that guesswork out. And that also then takes out the emotion of it, because sometimes getting feedback from the workforce can be contentious, but if it's just about what are the levers I need to pull, what the impact is going to be, then it kind of sits in the part of your brain that's quantitative and gets that emotional side out of it. So then it just becomes like, okay, we can make 3, 4, 5% more profit by doing this. Let's go. It's just, it creates much more of a impactful dialogue that's around metrics that matter versus guessing.
Well, and one of my favorite academic studies showed that people as they progress through deals, first deal is at, a certain point. Their second deal, they get better because they've learned lessons from the first one. In their third, they get worse. In their fourth, they get worse from there. And then they start to improve again. And the reason behind that is they learned the wrong lessons.
Yeah.
That having done it once, you've learned simply how not to make a ton of mistakes that are, rookie mistakes. But then there's this assumption that because it worked twice, that inherently is something you have to do. And having more real-time analytics and having things that you can track across time keep you from making the actual mistakes and allow you to pivot faster. I mean, pivoting is just the name of the game in private equity. And so figuring out how to do that in a time frame that can still achieve all your results at, the pace that you need to, I think is just so critical here.
Yeah, and I think to the experience, there's a big difference between a company that does 4 add-on acquisitions versus 20 add-on acquisitions, that it's not apples to apples in this case. And I think being able to recognize early on that you're not dealing with an apple, you're actually dealing with an orange is pretty important on this, right? And again, the other thing is that it doesn't discount past experience, but it gives you a way to validate that past experience and make sure that it's working in the present situation.
Great. So other comments on those attributes, or I want to leave some time for Q&A and being able to jump in. If anyone has questions, there is an open Q&A place that you can enter it. Some people have already suggested questions and really appreciate those, but feel free to populate your questions in there as well. We're happy to answer them. But as people are formulating their thoughts, Bob and Will, other thoughts on where this takes us as there are more tools out there, as more different types of analytics emerge, and we find ourselves in a place where there's in some ways too much information and not enough. So what?
Yeah, I think so. I might draw a comparison to a quality of earnings work on an acquisition. Every buyer does a QOE, but increasingly now we're starting to see sellers do their own QOE before they actually go out on it. Well, why? They want to know what the buyer is going to find out on it. Where are the issues in terms of our earnings? Where's the concentration? Where's the risk, et cetera, on it? That speaks to, I think, the way that the industry is going, both on the part of sellers and buyers. It's just more sophistication, and the desire on the part of at least the successful sellers, the ones that get a premium at the time of sale, to make sure that everything's buttoned up ahead of time. And I think, again, if you can come in with, all right, this is where the company was when we acquired it, this is what we've addressed, this is the overall state in terms of how satisfied the employees are, how comfortable they are with management, how challenged they are at work, et cetera, on it. That's just incredibly crucial on it. And it's an area that I think, again, as we started at the beginning, traditionally got pretty short shrift on it. But again, as we continue with increased sophistication on it, you're already seeing this in terms of outside consultants on diligence and these other things that are, weren't being done 10 years ago, but now definitely are being done. I think, the next area that you're going to see that on is the human capital side, and being prepared and being able to say, what's the story of this management team? Where were they? Where are they now? What's the impact on it? That shows, I think, a great understanding of your business, which I think a buyer, would be very, very happy about, and something that traditionally a seller does not provide on it. So again, I think it kind of goes with the continuum that we're in, that everything is getting more sophisticated, private equity definitely on it, diligence, et cetera. And this just kind of goes along for it, but traditionally was an area that wasn't really tracked that well and wasn't mapped that well.
And to add on that, I think there's also a shift in kind of how the metrics are being designed and used. There was, historically, there's been engagement surveys, which is about how engaged or happy a workforce is. but that doesn't necessarily mean they are able to perform. So then, or able to execute against the goals. So I think with the new kind of focus on performance management and correlating it to execution and the impact leaders have, it gets back to, how well, getting back to the simple two metrics of how well can these people address the challenges that they're given, how confident are they able to do it, and how well can the leaders keep them pointed in the right direction and performing. And it kind of comes down to, that's more important than, are they engaged? 60 people, 60% of them, or 30% of the people filled out a survey. That doesn't tell you anything, but this is what I need you to do, and this is how effectively I felt you were able to help me perform. That's a metric that is not only indicated of how competent and capable the organization is in performing, but also the impact the leaders are having. So I think you're going to see that shift as well too. Metrics that are directly correlated to performance, less so than, are people happy? Because, at least having been in different organizations, I don't know too many organizations that are highly performing, dropping lots of capital, drop lots and lots of cash. Everybody's about to exit. You might be stressed, but you're not leaving, and you're going to be engaged. So those are the types of situations where I think the metrics are starting to shift in how they're interpreted and what they are meant to interpret.
And I think we've said this a few times in different ways, but it's tying some of those sentiments to figuring out who can best execute upon them, and then finding, were those outcomes achieved, and where does that take you? And it's that last piece that I think historically has been missing, even for groups that do cultural surveys, and even for groups that are doing, behavioral analysis. And, especially in one of the things that on the Crucible, there are a lot of individual assessments that test leaders, but a lot of people miss testing the whole team. You can have a lot of superstars who cannot work together. You can have a bunch of people where the team is greater than the sum of the parts, and it wouldn't be obvious from the outside. And there might be individuals that are true linchpins in all of this that wouldn't come to the surface if you didn't understand what the employees want that business to be able to do in order to make their jobs easier, more productive, more actionable. And so there are a lot of these components that simply aren't measured for the most part today. And then you get down to it, and then we fire the CFO and replace them 3 times. And that gets to, a standard private equity cycle. That's not going to necessarily be the path forward for a lot of these organizations as we keep going and have more data available and have more actionable data available. So let's dive into some of these questions. So we're asked, what tools do you find to be the best to enable insights if you don't have many analytical resources on staff? Are there ways to get at these answers if you can't do it internally, or you don't have people with strong data skills?
I can touch on that one. You can use the technique that kind of a lot of these performance management tools are based on, which is called a modified Delphi technique. And if you just bring people into a room during a lunch and you give them all a yellow sticky note and you say, here's our goal. What's the one or two, list the top 3 things that you think we can do to achieve it. And you let them write it down. That's the anonymity, or at least confidentiality part of it. And then you put it on the board, and then you bring everybody together and say, okay, now organize these into themes. And you will see very quickly they'll organize into themes, and you can ask 3 or 4 questions. They'll go around sticky note to sticky note. And then you come back through and you say, okay, well, what were these themes? And then you say, okay, who's going to be responsible for addressing these 2 or 3 themes? And if you do that, you will find improvement. Your teams will improve. And you're basically going through the same methodology that the analytics do. They just do it at a much, much deeper, broader scale, so you get better precision. But you will get directional insight that's extremely valuable. And that methodology has been used for years. Analytics is just speeding it up, but just the yellow sticky note, put it on a wall around a critical business question, and then have them weight the impact it'll have on the business. That creates the priority, and then who's going to do it? And then you let the teams go out and they execute, and it works very well. That's actually the fundamentals of performance management in a lot of ways. And then the analytics behind it just give you better inference and better statistical numbers, but in the end, that's all it's doing.
And how do you address some of the issues of, feedback not being anonymous? Because I know that's one of the fears, I mean, especially if you're walking around with a Post-it note, but it's one of the fears with a lot of these surveys is that it's not anonymous and that someone is tracking you behind the scenes. And therefore, if you're not saying the positive things, it's going to negatively impact your continued employment or your perceptions in the workplace. How have you guys managed that in your spaces? And love to hear Will and then Bob maybe share how
Sure, I can touch on
aggregating and anonymizing data is so critical in your side of the fence as well.
Yeah, for sure on the finance side. On the workplace performance side, it's interesting because you don't need to know who the person is to get insight. So that's the fundamental thing, is really what you need to know is what are the bottlenecks, so what is causing the problem. So in all of our designs, we just have a single link. We do not know how to or who fills it out. We can't tie it back to anybody. So that's the first way we address it. The second thing is getting back to kind of those fundamental leadership needs. There's only 30 of them. And so really you're ranking, what is it that you need from your leader? What you're asking your workforce is, what do you need from us to make you more successful? Remove red tape, streamline operations. These are fundamental asks from the workforce up that the leaders are trying to figure out on their own anyway. Now you're just getting them more precisely, but they're not based on a Likert scale. So they're not on a 1 to 7 score. They're not on a, how well is my leadership? So, there's no way to be punitive as a workforce to say this leader stinks, this is, I hate him, I don't like him because I don't like his personality, I don't like her for whatever reason. But when it's just focused on what is it that you need, it becomes a very professional engagement, which is, this is what's annoying, this is what I need. The leader comes back and goes, okay, we heard you, let's go execute. And you're just knocking down the bottlenecks that impair performance. You're not getting into some of the other survey style, which is, how well would you rank your leader on a 1 to 10 scale? How well would you, it's just, what do I need to do to move? And then the analytics actually measure the impact on cultural performance. So you have a metric no different than you would have a revenue or an EBITDA, trailing 12-month metric. So that's how we've addressed it, is just focus on what you need to know to get the job done and measure that, and then leave the rest of it alone, and you'll be fine.
And I think it's also promoting within your organization the idea that we're not interested in any of those ancillary things you've seen on other surveys. We really just want to know what we need to do to get better, but also what we need to keep doing, because the ever-changing priorities, especially in PE-backed companies, can be challenging and can pose some whiplash for both leadership and, workforce alike. So
yeah, and in that context, it's a great way to align sort of interests on it, right? You're providing a forum where employees can be heard, but you're putting guardrails onto it to ensure that the feedback is actionable and not punitive. But yet that, ultimately, and again, you think about the situation where you can identify the biggest challenges and address them in, 2 weeks' time rather than a year's time. That should be empowering to the workforce, and that people are listening, and also it should make their lives and their jobs a little bit easier on it, right? It's still gonna be challenging working at a PE-backed company, but the challenges should be the challenges you're working on. It shouldn't be what you're dealing with at the time or waiting for a decision or these sorts of things that are outside of the employee's control.
good. We have 2 questions that are somewhat related here. One, is there any evidence that behavioral testing and interview process translates into successful employees in the PE setting? And, how often are people testing the teams as opposed to just the leader before entering in? The reason I say they're linked is that, yes, there is evidence in it. The Crucible's done actually quite a bit of work trying to ensure that it works, and that it works not just directionally, but specifically for various funds. But more than that, part of the historical challenge is that people are assessing subjectively, and when they have an assessment that has some more quantified elements, it's only specific to that person, not in the context of what's happening with the rest of the team or with the deal team they're going to be reporting to. And often those assessments that are used pretty broadly aren't designed for executives and aren't designed for private equity. And so it creates a little bit of a mismatch between the reference sets and what you're trying to find out. And so this is where having information that's more directly tied to the challenges at hand, to what you're trying to get out of people, and to understanding the context around it really matters. And that's why having more of these analytical tools and having ones that can be measured real time and give you better insights are going to be so critical as things move forward. Okay. Other question here, are we seeing a rise of the chief people officer and or finding opportunities to bring the benefits of human capital analytics to the portfolio companies from the funds? I think I'll just jump in quickly, and then if Will or Bob have additional commentary on this. Yes, there are more chief people officers or chief HR officers in some of these companies. I think more of the, I'll call it progressive funds, are saying, yes, we need to do this on a fund-wide level and creating talent functions that can be more thoughtful on that front. I still think it's pretty nascent. And even the rise of the operating partner wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of this investment space. But it's something that I think more and more funds are going to have to do, to think about how to leverage this information. Any other comments?
Say on the, I think on it, it's much more about, you have someone, if you think about it like P&L line items, you have people that are focused on operations, people are focused on different elements. I think when it comes to human capital metrics, what you're really looking for is, how do you facilitate those discussions among leaders to be able to take action? So it's less about, I think, less about thinking in terms of like traditional HR, and it's much more about thinking in terms of like, how do we take a new set of information that is impacting financials, is impacting revenue, is impacting overhead, and leverage that to its fullest extent. So it's almost an analytical application of, or it's a practical application of analytics within those discussion sets. And in our experience, we've seen some CEOs, they just, once they get their hands on the information, just becomes a part of their management meetings where they just talk through it. Like, here's the analytics from this source of data. How are we going to address it? And on some organizations, it gets assigned oftentimes to a COO who's more operationally oriented, say, okay, how are we going to operationalize this insight and how are we going to make an impact? So I really see it much more about the shift is assigning responsibilities to drive the insights into the organization to take full impact, or to leverage the full impact of its potential.
There's a question about when is the best time to apply these insights. My quick answer is always. But Bob, have you seen any thoughts about when some of the insights might be most relevant when thinking about how to build valuation across a hold, or whether it's more critical to benchmark before sale, or what you've seen on those fronts?
Yeah, I think it goes with with everything within a sales process, the earlier you start on whatever it is, the better off you're going to be, and generally the better you'll do in terms of valuation on it. So it's about, having the answer to every question that a potential buyer is going to ask on it, not having to fall back and figure out something once it's already been addressed by a potential buyer. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge for the average seller out there, is just not starting early enough on this. And then, if you start early on it, you can tell a really good story about the transformation of the investment and where it's come to. And I think that's always a positive when buyers are listening to it, that there has been action taken, it's been optimized, and that you've really been thoughtful about the period of time that you've held the company.
And to your earlier point, that your management can continue on and can be an asset for the business.
Exactly.
Not just people that are going to have to be replaced.
And I think another way to think about it is when they come in and they start looking at these analytics, is it an audit? In other words, is it feeling like an audit, or are you being proactive and now you're actually showing your leadership, or you're showing the strength of your team? So when you can actually stage it and show it in a manner just like you're selling a home, like here it is in its full potential, that it's only going to help you, versus being defensive and then it just turns into an audit where they're just looking for critical elements and you don't have the opportunity to really showcase the full worth.
Yep. Great. Well, one more question here in wrap up, but before I get to that, thanks to everyone for attending today. If you have specific questions, you can feel free to reach out to any of us. But Tim asks us, what technologies are available in the market to measure these elements other than surveys from Bains and McKinsey's of the world? And so that's part of why we developed the Performance Learning Leadership Lab to begin with, was to have a place that had a consolidated technology that we could provide to the market on a relatively cost-effective basis, that could have leadership traits, the performance metrics, and employee sentiments about what needs to be done, and the financial valuation information all tied together. So that was the salesiest bit that I will give today, but I'll throw the contact information for that in the chat. But thank you to privateequitycxo.com for allowing us to come speak to everyone today. And I really appreciate Will and Bob, you guys joining me.
Thanks for having us, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks everyone for joining. Take care.